Chapter 1. 21 Siren, August, 3009 in the Age of Crowns. Night had fallen over the fortress of Altfels. The city of Ractor beneath its high walls slept undisturbed and peaceful, while Idris Ranaru hurried like a rushed man through the dark corridors of the castle. Varys van Morgrim, the great king of all Vastar, wished to see him immediately. It had to be important, otherwise Varys van Morgrim, the scholar, would not have summoned him at such a late hour. Something that had never happened in recent years, as the king preferred to spend his nights with nothing but his books. After Idris had hurried up the stairs and passed through one portal or another, he finally reached the throne room. The great hall had been deserted for years and had not seen any legations from other kingdoms for ages. The high gallery with its 10 steps, where Varys' throne was supposed to stand, had been empty for a long time. As the king spent most of the day rummaging through the shelves of the old library, he had the throne moved to the library. After all, he attended to the more important official business there during the day and received messengers and envoys in the library, which served as his audience and throne room. But he did it half-heartedly and hastily. In his eyes, it was clearly a chore that his ministers, to whom he now left the governing, could also do. Varys had told Idris that he was tired of having to climb the steps of the gallery just to grant some vassal money for a pleasure palace because he wanted to enjoy himself undisturbed with his mistresses. Besides, Varys thought it was an impertinence to have to interrupt his thoughts to attend to mundane matters such as governing a kingdom. As soon as Varys had finished his dinner, he retired to the library and asked to be left undisturbed so that he could lose himself in old stories and science. The Cloud King. That was what he was now known as, and quite rightly so, as he rarely left the high towers of the fortress to show himself to his people. Idris could not understand this behavior, as he had been very successful in the early years of his reign, despite the many challenges and problems that his father had left him as heir. Varys van Morgrim took over an empire that had fought many wars against its neighbors and in distant lands. Since Varys had ascended the throne, it had enjoyed a long period of peace, as all the enemies around it had been burnt to ashes by the dragons. Their fortresses and cities destroyed, their lands devastated. Varys had put a lot of effort into turning the former enemies into friends. He had succeeded, as the other kings were also tired of the fighting and destruction and devoted themselves to rebuilding their countries. They reorganized their relations with the Reganians, whose bloodline Varys van Morgrim descended from. These successes were supposed to make Varys proud and keep him in the present. Success was fragile and fame faded if you did not live life to the full and strive to maintain what you had achieved. Yes, Varys had been a great king who had earned respect. All seemed well and there were no signs of new problems or challenges. Nevertheless, Varys had recently been talking more and more about wars that were yet to come. Of kings who would one day want to take on the 10 dragons of Vastar and their riders. He thought it was inevitable that the kingdoms of Eärendil would clash again. It was only a matter of time, Varys said, and the dragon fire would consume the world once more. Idris could understand much of what the king said. Others, however, he thought were unworldly drivel. Especially when it came to prophecies, to which Varys always attached greater importance. In recent years, the approaching end of the world through the White Dragon seemed to take up more and more space in his thoughts. A central doctrine of the powerful Church of the White Dragon, which had supported the throne of the Rhaegarans for generations. Idris had grown up with the king. He had known how he thought and felt for over 50 years. He knew how much he hated the Church's interference and its subtle power. An influence that had grown stronger over the years. It seemed all the more strange to Idris that Varys placed the Church's dogma of world destruction at the center of his own thinking. The king had started to turn to books a good 20 years ago. But that was not yet a big problem. It was only when his 2 young sons died mysteriously on the Crystal Lake that he withdrew more and more into his inner self. Idris often pondered the mystery of why the king had turned his back on the real world instead of overcoming his grief and fulfilling his duties. Just as he had done in the past when things got difficult. Idris hurried towards the large door that led into the library, in front of which the 6 men of the Night's Watch had taken up position. He paused for a moment in front of the closed doors, straightened his shoulders and calmed his breathing. Then he knocked. Through the thick wooden planks, he heard the king's voice inviting him to enter. The guards took hold of the copper rings on the door leaves and opened the entrance to the library to let Idris in. Once he had entered, they closed the door behind him. Idris could barely see in the dark. There were no candles. The king had forbidden them. No sparks should be able to harm the paper treasures. The pale glow of beetle lamps illuminated one corner or another. Idris strained to make out his surroundings, and after a while, as his eyes adjusted to the semi-darkness, shapes began to emerge from the gloom. Idris recognized the wall shelves. Shelves that reached up to the ceiling and were crammed with books. He saw stacks of ancient tomes piled up around the throne. Behind one of them, Idris noticed the reddish glow of a beetle lamp. "Come here," Idris heard the king say. He heard the tinkling of the insects that Varys was shaking in their glass container and saw how, behind a wall of hundreds of books, the light produced by the small, angry beetles flared up more brightly. "I'm coming, sir," Idris replied, carefully stepping over parchments and notes that littered the floor. "Lord, Lord," the king creaked, as if talking to himself. "I told you how much I hate it when you call me that." Idris stumbled over 3 or 4 books laid on top of each other and cursed softly. "Not those words," Varys said indignantly. "You're standing on holy ground." The king was probably alluding to the library's past, when it had not yet been defiled by the church. Defiled by the church. The Brocken monks had collected all the writings here before they were denigrated as pagans and false believers and driven out of Vastar. "Come on now," urged the king. "Where are you? What are you dawdling about for?" Idris walked around another bulwark of old papers and dusty tomes. Behind it, he found Varys sitting on a simple chair in front of a table full of parchments, scrolls, and books. The king wore a dark cloak that was in urgent need of cleaning. The crown sat atop shaggy, silvery hair. The unkempt beard was strewn with remnants of dinner. Bright, gray-blue eyes flashed beneath thick eyebrows. The clear windows of an alert mind. Varys beckoned Idris closer. "Take a look at this. Come here." Idris could see that a new, inner fire had taken hold of the king. His face, usually marked by worry lines and pensiveness, was joyful and radiant. Varys held a piece of brittle leather in his hands that appeared to be a map. Idris looked at drawings of hills, mountains, rivers, and lakes. Golden characters glittered in the flickering light of the lamp. "A map," Idris said, without appearing in any way impressed. Varys was clearly not interested in what Idris was thinking. He stroked the leather rapturously and with trembling fingers, as if he were touching a holy relic. "Not just any map," the king breathed. "It is the map of the Otherum. It shows the way to the soul's heart." Idris avoided shaking his head. "How do you know the map is real?" Varys looked at Idris with a mischievous expression. "Do you think I wouldn't have managed to dig through this mountain of books all these years, like a dwarf looking for a treasure, without finally solving this riddle?" Idris looked at the mass of books that filled the room. "Hard to imagine." The king raised his finger to emphasize his words. "I have done it. And now listen. I have read on these pages here." He placed his hand on a book that lay open on the table and paused for a devout moment, "what the map that leads to the soul's heart must be like. It must be made of leather. With the sign of the horned serpent at the lower right end." The king showed Idris the said mark on the piece of leather. "Here is the snake. Part of it is torn off, but you can still see an eye and one of the horns. And the leather still smells slightly of rosewood oil. A detail that is also mentioned in the scripture here. Soaking leather in rosewood oil was a method of preserving important documents. The map is almost 3,000 years old." "How do you know that?" Idris was actually very interested in how Varys had come to this realization. "It was hidden in this 3,000-year-old book." Varys pointed to a very large tome lying undignified on the floor at his feet, missing its binding. The book was written by Edel Darkai the sage from Iskandarin. It is written in Iridian, the language of the scholars.